45 million. Let's just sit with that number for a moment. A number this large doesn't really compute in the human mind. It becomes an abstraction. 45 million. And we need to be very clear. That number is not a metaphor. It isn't a symbol for some great tragedy. What you are looking at is a count of individual human lives. Each one a person with a name, a family, a consciousness that was simply extinguished. And what's truly unsettling is that this number is a conservative estimate. The reality is that most serious academic studies place the figure much higher. We're using the lowest boundary of what's generally accepted. The true final number? Well, that's something we will likely never know. So you have to ask, how did this happen? These weren't the casualties of a war. They didn't die because of a flood or a drought or some unstoppable plague. No, they died by design. Their deaths were a direct and frankly a foreseeable consequence of policy. The architect of this policy was a man named Mao Zedong. In the whole of human history, no other single leader is tied to a death toll on this scale. And yet, if you go to Beijing today, his portrait hangs over the Gate of Heavenly Peace. His face is on the money. Children in schools are taught to revere him as the father of the nation. Now, it's very tempting to just label him a monster, but that's too easy, isn't it? Because a monster is an exception. It lets us off the hook. This isn't a story about an exception. It's a story about a system. It's about how belief itself can be turned into a weapon. And to understand how a system like this gets built, you first have to understand the architect, not as some caricature, but as a quiet, careful student of human nature. His story begins in a completely ordinary way. He was born in 1893 in a small village to a peasant family. There was absolutely nothing about his early life to suggest he would become a figure of such immense consequence. He was a quiet child, an observant child, and he grew up to become an obsessive reader. He read everything: history, philosophy, political theory. But you see, he wasn't reading for pleasure. He was reading for instruction. He was looking for a user's manual, for power. And this is such a crucial insight. The most dangerous leaders are almost never uneducated. Their education is just of a very different kind. They study people. He may not have been a brilliant student in the traditional sense, but he was a brilliant observer. He would watch the way power moved in a room. He studied who commanded attention and who gave it. He was analyzing, always analyzing, how groups form, how loyalty is built, and how fear can be used to break people apart. You know, we have this comforting idea that education is a kind of moral safeguard, that the more you learn, the more humane you become. But history shows us again and again that this just isn't true. For him, education wasn't a restraint. It was a tool. It gave him the language, the historical examples, the philosophical cover to justify what he was doing. It didn't prevent cruelty, it refined it and made it systematic. So he had all these observations about human behavior, but they were still just ideas. Soon, he would see them applied on a massive scale. He was about to discover the physics of power, not as a theory, but as a real, tangible force. The year is 1919. Protests erupt across the country. For nearly everyone involved, it was a moment of pure political expression, of national anger. But for him, it was a laboratory. He watched as a government that seemed all-powerful began to crack under the pressure of organized crowds. And he learned a fundamental equation. An individual person, fragile, easily dismissed, easily broken. But people, when they're bound together by a single idea, they become a physical force, a force that can actually bend reality. The challenge wasn't creating the force, it was learning how to aim it. Years later, during the famous Long March, his movement was on the verge of being completely wiped out. They were surrounded, they were starving, they were losing. In that kind of absolute failure, most leaders would lose control. But he perfected it. He walked side by side with his soldiers. He ate what they ate. He slept on the same cold ground. He didn't issue commands from a safe distance. He got close. He listened to their fears. He wasn't their commander. He was their companion in suffering. And why did that work? Because shared suffering is maybe the most powerful glue for devotion that exists. It just burns away all the intellectual arguments and leaves this primal emotional bond. Think about it. People don't remember the details of policies. They remember, with perfect clarity, who was standing next to them when their world was falling apart. That's how real loyalty is made. It's not a deal. It's an imprint. So then you fast forward to 1949.
And when he stands before that massive crowd and declares the founding of a new nation, the people below him were weeping with joy. It's so important to understand they were not cheering for the arrival of a dictator. They were cheering for the arrival of hope, the promise that a century of chaos and hunger was finally over. They were cheering for order.
And really, this is how it almost always begins. People don't choose tyranny. They choose order. They choose simple answers when life has become unbearably complicated. They vote for a strong hand to stop the chaos. The deal is made, the agreement is signed long before the true price is ever revealed. That incredible hope that filled the square in 1949 was about to be consumed by an ideology that cared more about its own story than about reality. That agreement for order was about to be tested by a system that demanded belief, even if it meant total self-destruction. The plan was called the Great Leap Forward. The idea was to turn the country into an industrial superpower, almost overnight. So these incredibly ambitious goals were set for things like steel and grain. But the whole system had one fatal flaw. It punished the truth. Imagine you're a local official. If you report that the harvest failed, you're not just a failure, you're an enemy of the cause. But if you report an impossible, miraculous harvest, well, now you're a patriot. So what did they do? They lied. And the numbers they sent up the chain of command, they just soared into fantasy. So on paper, in the official reports, the nation was witnessing the greatest economic boom in human history. Grain production was off the charts. Steel was being made in little backyard furnaces. A second reality, a reality made of pure belief, was being built in the capital. Meanwhile, on the ground, in the villages where that grain was supposed to be, reality collapsed. Now, this wasn't a famine in the way we usually think of one. It wasn't caused by a drought. The food was there. But because the official reports showed these massive surpluses, the government came to collect its share. Grain was taken from starving villages and was even exported to other countries to prove how successful the system was. The belief in success had become more important than the reality of human survival. And people starved in silence, because to admit you were starving was to admit the belief was a lie, and that was a betrayal. When you look at the records from that time, you don't find stories of riots or mass protests. There are no heroic last stands, there is only absence. The quiet emptying of houses, entire villages with no one left. This is what it looks like when an ideology is working perfectly. It's not chaos, it's just disappearance. Now, after a failure of this size, you would think any rational system would have to reverse course, admit the mistake. But this system didn't. It escalated. Having failed so spectacularly to control reality, it turned its focus to the one thing it could control: thought itself. So who did they go after? Teachers, writers, intellectuals, anyone who dealt in complexity and critical thinking. They were publicly humiliated. Soon, independent thought wasn't just an error, it was a crime. The very act of doubting the official story was redefined as the ultimate betrayal. And when you make an entire population afraid of its own thoughts, you don't need as many soldiers in the streets. People start to police themselves and each other. He died in 1976, but the system didn't die with him. It just evolved. It shed the loud, chaotic cult of personality, and it became a quieter, more efficient machine. The public humiliations were replaced with quiet surveillance. The slogans were replaced with algorithms. The methods were updated, but the goal, the control of thought, that remained exactly the same. And all of this leads to a very uncomfortable truth. The most powerful systems of control don't function just because of terror. Terror is messy, it's inefficient. No, the most durable systems rule through agreement. A quiet, unspoken agreement to trade away your freedom for a feeling of certainty. An agreement to just believe because the alternative, thinking for yourself, has been made to feel too dangerous. It's easy to look at the story as just that, a piece of history, something that happened over there, a long time ago, but that would be missing the point. This is a warning, because the fundamental problem here isn't one man, or one country, or one particular ideology. The problem is us. It's how easily we, as human beings, hand over the difficult work of thinking and moral choice to a belief system.
how much we crave a simple, powerful story that explains everything, and how fiercely we will defend that story, even when the facts, when reality itself, screams that it's wrong.
And if there is one thing to take away from all of this, it is this. Evil does not show up with a sign declaring its intentions. It explains itself. It offers a clear rationale. It gives you a system. It promises a better world. And all it asks from you in return is your belief.